or how to understand the way a society spends its money in a market. Leontief was born in Munich, German Empire, on August 5, 1905. He died on February 5, 1999 in New York, USA. Vasily Leontief was born into a well-to-do academic family in St. Petersburg, Russia. His father was a labor economist at the local university, his mother an art historian. Vasily Leontief enrolled at the University of Leningrad in 1921 at the tender age of 15. He started out in philosophy but eventually moved on to economics, earning his MA in 1925. Finding times in communist Russia difficult, his parents emigrated to Germany, bringing Leontief along with them. Continued his studies at the University of Berlin in 1928 with Werner Sombat and Ladislaus Vortievics, and received the PhD degree, having submitted a dissertation on the theoretical subject Wirtschaft als Kreislauf. As a member of the staff of the Institute for World Economics at the University of Kiel from 1927 to 1930, engaged in a research of derivation of statistical demand and supply curves, he got in trouble by expressing vehement opposition to the lack of intellectual and personal freedom under the country's communist regime. He was arrested several times. He immigrated to the United States in 1931, teaching at Harvard University, where he became a professor in 1964. He organized the Harvard Economic Research Project in 1948 and served as its director until 1973. Leontief married poet Estelle Marx in 1932, with whom he shared one daughter. I want to share three statements Leontief produced, which seem to me very important to understand his work. Page after page of professional economic journals are filled with mathematical formulas leading to the reader from sets of more or less plausible but entirely arbitrary assumptions to precisely stated but irrelevant theoretical conclusions. End of quote. Quote, "The human worker will go the way of the horse." End of quote. Quote, "The statistical study presented in the following pages may best define it as an attempt to construct, on the basis of available statistical materials, a tableau économique of the United States for 1919 and 1929. 150 years ago, when Quesnay first published his famous scheme, his contemporaries and disciples acclaimed it as the greatest discovery since Newton's laws. The idea of general interdependence among the various parts of the economic system has become by now the very foundation of economic analysis. Yet, when it comes to the practical application of this theoretical tool, modern economists must rely exactly as Quesnay did upon fictitious numerical examples." End of quote. Vasily Leontief created the input-output analysis, which describes the interdependence in the production system as a network of deliveries between the various sectors of production. The method provided tools for a systematic analysis of the complicated interindustrial transactions in an economy. Leontief is also distinguished for having developed linear programming, a mathematical technique for solving complex problems of economic operations. Having come to the conclusion that so-called partial analysis cannot provide a sufficiently broad basis for fundamental understanding of the structure and operation of economic systems, he set out in 1931 to formulate a general equilibrium theory capable of empirical implementation. He received a research grant for compilation of the first input-output tables of the American economy for the years 1919 and 1929 in 1932. Began to make use of a large-scale mechanical computing machine in 1935, and Mark I, the first large-scale electronic computer, in 1943. After publication of Structure of the American Economy, 1999, and 1929 in 1941, he continued working on the development of the input-output theory and of its various applications. Leontief is also credited with his discovery on the Leontief paradox and the composite commodity theorem. Throughout his professional life, Leontief promoted the use of quantitative data in economics. Leontief campaigned for broader and deeper developments in the area of quantitative data analysis throughout his career. He was also one of the first economists to use a computer for quantitative research. The input-output analysis. One area in which Leontief pursued his goal of making economic analysis more quantitative was in developing an empirical implementation of general equilibrium theory. To do this, Leontief broke down the U.S. economy into 500 sectors, establishing one of the first economic sector classification systems. He developed input-output tables for sector analysis that estimated the impact a change in production of a good has on other industries and their inputs, establishing the interdependent relationships of economic sectors. Leontief paradox. Leontief also studied trade flows in the 1950s. Based on input-output analysis of international trade, he discovered that the U.S., a country with a great deal of capital, was importing capital-intensive commodities and exporting labor-intensive commodities. This is in contrast to prior theories of international trade, which predict that countries will specialize in and export goods that they have a comparative advantage in producing. This means that a capital-rich country such as the U.S. will be expected to export capital-intensive goods and import labor-intensive goods from countries where labor is comparatively cheaper. The Leontief paradox, as it came to be known, led many economists to question the Heckscher-Ohlin theorem, which states that countries produce and export what they can create most efficiently, depending on their factors of production. Moreover, they import goods that they cannot produce as efficiently. Several later economists proposed solutions to this apparent paradox, including the Linder hypothesis and the home market effect. To perform the test about Heckscher-Ohlin theorem, Leontief constructed the 1947 input-output table of the U.S. economy. He aggregated industries into 50 sectors, but only 38 industries produced commodities that entered the international markets, and the remaining 12 sectors were created for accounting identities and non-traded goods. He also aggregated factors in two categories, labor and capital. He then estimated the capital and labor requirements to produce. The U.S. seems to have been endowed with more capital per worker than any other country in the world in 1947. Thus, the Heckscher-Ohlin theory predicts that the U.S. exports will have required more capital per worker than U.S. imports. However, Leontief was surprised to discover that U.S. imports were 30% more capital-intensive than U.S. exports. In 1956, Leontief repeated the test for U.S. imports and exports, which prevailed in 1951. In his second study, Leontief aggregated industry into 192 industries. He found that U.S. imports were still more capital-intensive than U.S. exports. U.S. imports were 6% more capital-intensive. The transition of the U.S. economy from a wartime to a peacetime economy was not complete until the 1960s. Notably, Leontief's paradox does not account for human capital and the resulting difference between skilled and unskilled labor. Later researchers show that U.S. exports were skilled labor-intensive, or in other words, human capital-intensive relative to imports, resolving the Leontief paradox in favor of the comparative advantage view. Leontief's contributions to economics were not limited to input-output. His 1936 article on composite commodities made him, together with Higgs, the father of that famous microeconomic theorem. The composite commodity theorem was a third major development credited to Leontief, who fathered the concept with John Higgs. This states that if the relative prices of a basket of goods are assumed to be fixed, then they can be treated as a single composite good for the purpose of mathematical modeling. This simplified the equations needed to model price theory. His early reviews of Keynes' general theory 1936, 1937, 1947, 1948 were important stepping stones to the neo-Keynesian synthesis stress of fixed nominal wages in interpreting Keynes' theory. Among his classic contributions are his 1933 article on the analysis of international trade via indifference curves, which is still learned today, his nonlinear curve model 1934, and his 1946 contribution on the wage contract, which outlined what is now a classical application of the principal-agent model before that term was invented. As a critic, Leontief's repeated admonishment of economics for its misuse of mathematics and quantitative methods and the lack of relevance and realism in its theorizing, e.g. 1938, 1954, 1959, and 1971, are both lucid, sharp, and still pertinent. In his final years, he centered his attention on analysis of environmental disruption and economic growth, while maintaining at the same time active interest in wider problems of scientific methodology and broader issues of social and economic policies and evolutionary and revolutionary change. The Heckscher-Holden theory states that each country exports the commodity which intensively uses its abundant factor. The Heckscher-Holden theory was generally accepted on the basis of casual empiricism. Moreover, there wasn't any technique of computers to test the Heckscher-Holden theory until the input-output analysis was invented by Leontief. Leontief's greatest achievement was the creation of a new area of economics, namely input-output analysis. In 1941, he published the classic Structure of American Economy, which laid the foundation for what is now known as a social accounting matrix. Analysts can use input-output analysis to estimate the impacts of positive and negative economic shocks by showing the change in demand for inputs when the production of outputs changes. This helps to analyze ripple effects throughout an economy as changes in demand for final goods work their way up the supply chain. Output-input tables can produce very rough estimates for small or moderate changes in outputs, but because they assume fixed production technology, they cannot accurately account for the dynamics of a real economy. Leontief's input-output analysis has been used by the World Bank, the United Nations, and the U.S. Department of Commerce. The core principle of Leontief's economic analysis is the concept of understanding the economy as a whole and recognizing the interdependence between different parts of the economy. And this understanding of interindustrial relationships is at the heart of the theoretical model behind the input-output analysis. Further, the practical applications of the input-output analysis help us study the direct and indirect effects of changes in demand in one sector and their impact on employment levels in various sectors of the economy. And with that analysis, the politicians take decisions about which sector support in order to maintain employment levels balanced. And we know we are affected by those decisions. So now you can have a better perspective of its importance.